I'm going to make this one quick because it's not necessarily something that I want to dwell all that much on. I'm not quite sure how many people are fully interested in this particular video at this point. I've covered this story because I found this story to be utterly fascinating. I mean, on a prime scale, a man was broken and ripped to pieces. And it appears that the United States knew that something was going to take place, either that they knew that they were going to kill him or at the very least take him away. In no way does Donald Trump care about this. In no way does the United States care about this. It's more of an annoyance. And for the longest time, the United States pretended as if there was some doubt. Pretended as if there's some doubt. MBS, as they like to call him, as his friends call him, Mohammed bin Salman. Saudi Arabia has come out initially with an utterly ludicrous story, utterly ridiculous. A man walks into an embassy and vanishes. And then the people who are in the embassy say, we have no idea what happened to him. Now, right off the bat, say he was abducted by aliens. Just go there. That is more believable than we have no idea what happened to him. Turkey comes out immediately and says, Saudi Arabia had this man killed. 18 thick-necked brutes, or 15 to 18 thick-necked brutes, get off of an airplane. One with a bone saw. They torture, break him, rip his body to shreds, chop his body up, and toss his body into the lawn before getting back on the plane and leaving. Turkey was very specific because they had the embassy bugged. They had an audio and visual of him being brutally ripped apart. Apparently, he was set upon as soon as he walked into the embassy. All while maybe a yard, well, a few meters outside, the woman that loved him waited and waited and waited. And in his last moments, as he was in pain and being tortured, she waited, believing, full well believing, that he was going to come back out and marry her. There's something about this that makes it that much worse when the idea that the woman was standing outside waiting on him. That bites into me. I don't particularly know why, but it does. Saudi Arabia, after a certain degree of political pressure, because of the lunacy of their previous story of we have no idea what happened to the guy in the embassy to which that guy walked into, and with Turkey being very specific of you murdered this man, dismembered this man, and threw his body parts into the yard, eventually comes back and says, okay. The other story was ludicrous, so we'll give you a less ludicrous story. The 15 brutes that came in and the guy with the bone saw, they were talking and it went bad. He started a fight with the 15 men and the guy with the bone saw. Their story is utterly ludicrous. Perhaps slightly tepidly less ludicrous than the previous story, but ludicrous nonetheless. And nobody buys this particular story. Now, the catch is the belief, and if I was a prosecutor, I guess I would make this argument, is that the person who's running the show is MBS, Mohammed bin Salman. And this guy who has been out there murdering Yemenis, and let's be very clear on this, Obama gave the green light on this. Whatever people want to say about Obama, he is in office. He knows that the weapons that he's given him is going to be used to kill and rip and burn and maim Yemenis, many of which were just innocent people, just like you and just like me, trying to pursue whatever life they can pursue. He did it anyway. That guy who uses all of his oil wealth to pacify the population, to pacify the public, and in this case, to kill Yemenis. Implicated, but it's more so the inner circle is taking a fall for him There is a difference in those things. Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman on Wednesday described the killing of Washington Post columnist Jamal Khashoggi as heinous crime in the first comment since the closest aides were implicated in Saudi journalist's death. Speaking at an investors conference in Riyadh, he said that has been overshadowed by the crisis. Salman said that those responsible for the killings will be brought to justice. No, they won't be. They will never be brought to justice because that person is you. The person is you. Yes, the person who killed them may, because political pressure has essentially compelled the behavior where you have to dissipate and discharge the anger that's being thrust upon the government based on this. But the individual that called for this will never be brought to justice, aside from you getting cancer or getting hit by a bus. This was a very painful incident for all Saudis and for everybody on this planet. It was unnecessary, he said. Yes, it was unnecessary to have such a fragile ego. Such a fragile ego. Where the criticisms of this man needed to have him ripped apart in this way. And the level of hubris to believe that you can get away with something like this. A man walks in an embassy and vanishes? Are you fucking kidding me? The crisis had presented a threat to bin Salman in a way that a bloody war in Yemen, the alleged abduction of the Lebanese prime minister, and a crackdown on dissident at home have not. After Saudi Arabia admitted over the weekend that Khashoggi was killed on October 2nd in its Istanbul consulate, 5 high-ranking officials were dismissed, including bin Salman's media chief, deputy head of the Saudi intelligence services. 18 people were arrested. The Saudi case here is nonsense. Why did the guy go with a bone saw? Why did you end up chopping his body up? All of these things make no sense. Why did you need 15 or 18 people? How many other people were there? Thick-necked brutes. What I'm making the point here that the Saudi story is utter nonsense. It's utter nonsense. But the story doesn't need to make sense. Several things have been taking place here that needs to be understood. The first has to do with the righteous indignation and anger all across the world. Every country that my wife and I have been at, this story is lit. People are pissed off. I've watched one European country after the next in European Parliament freak out. Not just over this, but essentially it's like an argument with your wife where you're bringing up shit that happened 5 years ago. Meaning, even though the Yemeni conflict wasn't enough to essentially say, hey, maybe we shouldn't have any dealings with this batshit crazy, psychopathic, theocratic regime, the death of this one man was enough to spearhead all of this other stuff coming up. Meaning, when those European countries in European Parliament was going after them, calling for sanctions, the Yemen war came up. The death of essentially the Lebanese minister, all of the stuff that they've done over the past have come up. But this was the thing that was the spearhead. This has created a certain righteous indignation and anger because of the level of hubris associated with it. This has been used as a proxy to attack Donald Trump. I suggest that when Mike Pompeo went to speak to the Saudis, what he probably told them was, nobody believes you. This is utter nonsense. You need to come up with a way to dissipate the anger that's presented to you because it's providing a way of attacking us. Meaning, this problem that you've caused is now becoming a problem for us. You need to do something about this. And the response to that ended up being, fine, we'll toss somebody out to the wolves. We'll toss somebody out to the wolves. The idea being that throwing these people into the chum may be able to dissipate the anger and indignation that's presented to them, with the idea that the UK and the United States can main likely did about it was to come clean for himself, saying, okay, yes, this looks like the Saudis did this. This looks pretty bad. Meaning he couldn't necessarily hold that line of, I don't know what took place, I have no idea what happened, etc., 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 because the pressure had gotten to be too much. They needed a way to discharge and dissipate the pressure. And the way to dissipate the pressure was, fine, we believe the Saudis did it. We believe the world community on this, that the Saudis had something to do with it. And they're doing something about it now, so we don't have to change our relationship with that government. The fact of the matter is, the culprits, the person who was responsible for calling this, will never be brought to justice. The only thing that you would get out of this is that the political pressure was enough to draw enough heat that forced, A, the Trump administration to own up to the fact that these guys did this, and B, forced them to, at the very least, admit, okay, we were responsible for this guy's dying. The person who was responsible will never be brought to justice. I'm going to end this, and I'm going to push up my local video because I know this thing stopped quite often. This is fascinating political currents. And like I said, the political currents for this haven't been dissipated to some degree, but not necessarily worn out, especially when you're talking about the European nations where they are calling for sanctions. And you have some businesses that find Saudi Arabia at this point as being radioactive. Stay tuned. I mean, even the United States is talking about sanctioning the specific individuals who Saudi Arabia has said was involved in this process. But getting rid of weapons deals? No. Those weapons deals are going to remain. Is the relationship going to change? No. That relationship is not going to change at all. Is there going to be real consequences? Maybe for some countries. I mean, Germany is talking about, Angela Merkel has taken this one strident stand of saying she's not going to do any dealings with them. And if I'm not mistaken, Australia has come out. But is the relationship between Saudi Arabia and the United States changing? No, it is not. The person responsible will never be brought to justice. The people who did the killings, yes. The person who ordered it, not so much. When I was in Nepal, I always tell travel stories. When I was in Nepal, I was staying at a hotel. I think it was like $10 a night. The hotel wasn't all that bad. The problem in the hotel, and this is me being somewhat, picky, in order to go to the bathroom, there was a very large step. And I know this sounds utterly ridiculous, but whatever. I'm a person, and I have my own idiosyncrasies. I like to be relatively comfortable. And in this place, the step was so large, like it's hard to get across, but it was a really high step to get to the bathroom. And in the mornings, or at times where you're kind of drowsy, you're kind of out of it, I kept stomping my toe on that goddamn step, or I would kept missing the step or hitting it in a weird way. You must understand, during this time that I was traveling, I wasn't necessarily in the best of health either, because this was during a time where, this was in 2008, I had a transplant. The transplant had failed, and with that transplant failing, I decided, fuck it. I got fired while I was in the hospital. I'm going traveling. Had a bit of cash in the bank. Worked as a software engineer for, at that point, several years. And so Nepal was one of the places that I went, Kathmandu. I estimated that at the rate of failure, I had 7 months. Fucking way overblown. I think I ended up with like 2. But I ended up in Nepal, Kathmandu, hitting my toe on that thing, and I was like, I can't stay at this hotel. Like this, there's nothing wrong with it other than this. I can't stay at this hotel. And so I go to check out of the hotel, and the hotel guy talks me out of it. And I feel bad for the guy, and because it feels like he needed the room. He needed somebody to rent the room. So one of the days, they used to have blackouts because they didn't have enough power in order to keep the lights on. So every during the course of a day, like every once or twice a day, within an hour or two, they would cut off all the power. And so I wake up, it's pitch black. I'm like, what the fuck? Where's the lights? And I go down, and there was a patio out back where it was this kind of garden of sorts where people in a hotel can kind of chill. And he's just out, just kind of reclining. He's like, oh, sit down, relax and everything. And he starts telling me about what's taking place politically in Nepal. I know this is a long story in order to get to it. He says, we have a king here. And the king has been given his marching orders. Now, this is fascinating. And he says, and the king being given his marching orders, we have no idea what the king is going to do. He said, it's very possible that the king could use the military and fight parliament on this, or the king could walk away. We have no idea what's going to take place. And the country was on pins and needles as it waited for the response of the king on whether or not the king was going to kick rocks. The other thing that he told me was that the king wasn't necessarily supposed to be the king, that the king killed his brother. Now, this is fascinating because he said the moment that the king killed his brother, the king turns around and says, oh my God, my brother has been killed. We need to find the guilty party. But now that I am king, we would pursue, business as usual. So the guy, even though he killed his brother, now he is king. And how do you deal with a king that has just murdered his brother? Like, this was fascinating politics. That said, that king ended up just walking away. Even though people are on pins and needles, at some point the king just left. He didn't fight. He just left. The thing I want to get here is this interesting thing of the guy offing his brother. And because he ends up being king, nobody can touch him and nobody can do anything about it. The culprit of the crime will never be brought to justice. MBS, the culprit of the crime will never be brought to justice. I don't know if anybody's here. And this was a lot of wood to chop to tell what I was talking about. Let's see. When you finish your stream, could you please ask people to check out the Unity for YouTube? Does an update on Free Assange campaign? Will do. I guess I just did, to be honest. Why are we even aligned with a country that still has kings? That alone should tell you to watch out for them. Dude, I agree with you, but Britain has a king, or a queen anyway. But I know what you mean. You're talking about totalitarian countries. Yes, that's true. But you must understand the United States has aligned and installed totalitarian systems. I got into, it wasn't an argument. It was a conversation with my nurse at the clinic here in Lisbon. And he made the point, he says, all of these Muslim countries have strong men. All of them. And he was pretty defined on this point, completely missing the point that not all of them used to have strong men. Iran used to be a democratically elected country. It used to be a secular, not a secular government, but a democratically elected government. If I am not mistaken, so of Afghanistan. And there was a time period where Iraq had an egalitarian leader in that country. But you must understand, oil tends to be the thing that damages those countries, especially with regards to the United States and Western powers. When Iraq got to the point where it was going to use this oil for itself, Western powers got into action and supported the Ba'ath Party. If you remember, the Ba'ath Party is essentially Saddam Hussein's party. They supported a coup in that country. Same thing in Iran, and we can look at what Afghanistan is today. It is not necessarily as straightforward as to say that all of those countries just have strong men. Yes, all of those countries have strong men now, but those countries have histories where they didn't necessarily have those strong men. I feel you, though. The reason why we're allied with Saudi Arabia has to do with oil. This pact, what is it called? The oil for protection racket that we've had with them going back to the 40s with Roosevelt. We have been allied with them for a very, very long time. And all of it boils down to oil and a relationship that we have with oil, petrodollar, and all this other stuff, where the oil must be bought in dollars. It gives us a certain degree of hegemony in world markets, especially within regards to energy markets. That's the reason for the relationship. Not to mention, Saudi Arabia supplements our weapons manufacturers. The United States, at this point, sells weapons. Part of the reason when Trump was jumping into European countries where they was trying to say you need to up your military budgets was because Donald Trump just wanted to sell them more weapons. Our weapons corporations, to some degree, is supplemented by Saudi Arabia. They buy our weapons. As the Pentagon, it was an article in the New York Times, when the Pentagon's budget dipped, meaning when it wasn't necessarily buying more weapons or as many weapons as typical, I guess, Saudi Arabia made up the gap. That's why. If you want to know why, that's why. We get oil from them. They buy our weapons. Security for oil. That's the racket. That's the racket for the last 40, 50, 60 years. So, oil has been God for some time. There's a statue here. I'm going to end it on this. There's a statue here. Portugal has been a stable, semi-socialist model government, supports local businesses, no IMF. I love it here. I could live here. Full stop. I could live here. There are very few countries that say that. This is one of them. I don't speak the language, so it would be difficult, but there is a style and equality to this country that's compelling. Even the way people communicate, the way people address each other, it's a compelling thing. Now, mind you, living in the country is different than being a fly on the wall. Ultimately, for all intents and purposes, I'm always an observer in this. I don't speak the language, so I'm always outside of it. It's like regardless of how close I get to it, I can only get but so close to it. So I'm only ever peering into a thing. I can't necessarily fully understand the thing to which I'm experiencing. But it's clear here that there is a laid backness and a less harshness in the way Europe goes about its affairs. Even to the degree of treatments. Like even when you're getting dialysis here. So in the United States, you can push about, I know this is not necessarily going to fully make sense, and I'll cut this part of the video, but you can pull 2,000 liters per hour, meaning whatever you drink, you keep with you until you have a treatment to pull it off. So you can imagine that if you drink a huge amount, that stays with you. It becomes fluid. It settles in your skin and your ankles and sometimes in your chest. If you have too much fluid on, it becomes difficult to function, difficult to breathe, difficult to move. And so, when they pull it off, ideally, you don't necessarily want to have a huge amount on. Also, depending on how much they pull, in a normal person, if I'm not mistaken, losing about 10% of your body weight kills the person. There's only so much fluid that an individual can lose before that person essentially goes unconscious or loses thing. So when they pull, there's a certain amount that they can pull that an individual can tolerate. Beyond the point where the individual can tolerate, the individual passes out, their blood pressure bottoms out, and the individual, it goes out. In the United States, they will allow you to go hard. They will allow you to go hard, meaning they will pull you hard. Here, no, not so much. Now, this is problematic. And this is not even just problematic, slightly annoying to me. When I cannulate myself. I do my own treatments at home. For the last 3 years, I've controlled my own treatment schedule. Just me. I set up my machines. I put in my needles. Yes, I stick my own self with these needles the size of ink pens. I have to clean all of it up. I do my own blood work. I give my own blood. All of it. Independent in regards to the way I go about my treatments. If I feel tingling in my fingers, that means my calcium is low. I need to take more calcium. If I feel muscle weakness, my potassium is high. That means I'm not getting enough treatments. All of those things are things that I need to process and be aware of. You must be aware of your body. Otherwise, your body will fuck you over. And I have fucked up once or twice and ended up in the hospital for not being aware of my limitations. Not recently, this was years ago. Coming here, I'm going to treatments, like I'm in treatment things. And the Portuguese are like any other, like a facility is a facility is a facility. And so going from a situation where I am in complete control of this stuff to having to deal with nurses and all, I bristle at some of the stuff that takes place. One of those things where it's like bristling at was me telling him, you need to pull this much. And they're like, ooh, we can't do that. It's like, what do you mean you can't do that? I'm only asking you to pull 5 kilos. And he's like, 5 kilos in 4 hours? Yes. Now in America, that wouldn't be an issue. Nobody would think twice about it. It's high, it's a lot. But it's not something where it's like, oh my God, we can't do that. And it's certainly not something, it's like me telling him to do this under normal circumstances. I would just be in control of it and I would just do it. And the nurse is like, ugh, I don't know, man. You're the strongest man alive. It was like, what are you talking about? What are you talking about? I need you to pull this. Because when I go to other areas, I need to make sure that I don't have fluid on me. And it is imperative that you pull this because I don't want to function with fluid on. Not to mention I've lost weight. But like it's all that type of stuff where I'm trying to explain to him. And they're like, oh, I don't know, I'm uncomfortable with this. I'm voted down on this. Like they veto my authority in trying to make this work. This is aggravating to me because under normal circumstances, I am in control of this. And now, being in Europe, not so much. Not so much. I have to tell myself that they don't know that I've been doing this for 20-something years. They don't know that I've been in control of this for the past 3 years or so. They don't necessarily fully soak into that I am going from place to place to place. And in going from place to place to place, I am in charge of this stuff, not them. They don't know that. From their standpoint, I am a patient, just like any other patient, who just so happens speaks a different language, who just so happens comes from a different country, but for all intents and purposes are now under their care. And being under their care, they care. They're nurses. A dialysis nurse is a dialysis nurse is a dialysis nurse, whether they're in the United States or in this case, whether they're in Portugal. I have to calm myself down on stuff like this. I don't like people undermining my own self-determination. And in this case, there's certain procedures and everything that I'm stuck with because their country is just constructed a particular way. The machines don't even allow it. It's what it is. It's what it is. It's a learning curve, man. And you know, it's funny, and then I'll end it on this. One of the things I told him, I said, look, my weight is 81 kilos. And he says, 81 kilos? He says, that sounds like a lot. I mean, it sounds like you have a lot of weight on. Now, when I first got into Portugal, I did, because there was a gap between the time I left Cairo to the time I got to Portugal. Now, this was planned. I knew it was going to be like a 5-day gap between the two. And I knew that between the two times, there was going to be a certain amount of fluid that I put on. You put in spa days because you try to pull some of the fluid out of your skin. And being in Egypt, it's hot. And so for the most part, your physical activity, you get to sweat that stuff out. So your environment, to some degree, indicates your behavior, at least in this regard. And by the time you get to Portugal, though, Portugal is much cooler, so you don't necessarily get that advantage of it being blistering hot. Not to mention, you know, spa days and stuff like that in order to kind of pull the stuff out of your skin. So there was a certain amount of fluid that was built on that needed to be pulled off. And he's, like, again, a dialysis nurse, a dialysis nurse. One woman comes in, she can't breathe. She was like, she has like 8 kilos on. That's like about 18 pounds of fluid on. And sometimes it builds up in your chest and you have a hard time breathing. And so she can't breathe. I tolerate fluid pretty well, so I can have a huge amount on and still function. I don't like having it on, but I can function. And I think I have, like, let's say 6 kilos on. But again, it was a long period of time. The doctor comes in. The doctor is Russian. And he says, she's Russian. And he says something racist. He's like, yeah, you know, those Russians are so-and-so and so-and-so. It was like, okay, whatever. Fair enough. And he turns, and he's speaking in Portuguese, but I know what he's saying because I know a nurse is a nurse is a nurse. This is fucking hilarious, man. It's people are people anywhere you go. Like, honestly, I've been all over the world. A smile is a smile is a smile. An asshole is an asshole is an asshole. And you find those things in every country you go to. Some countries are harder, meaning the United States is more coarse in the way that we go about our affairs. We're more brutal and more rigid. Brits are more rigid. They're more stiff in the way that you engage with them. But other countries are not like that way. The Portuguese are far more, I want to say soft, but soft is not the right word for it. And this is a relative comparison between the two things. It's a more laid back society. That's what it is. My thing is dropping off. All right, I'm gonna end this. When I got to the point where, especially when I started looking for a relationship, like a serious relationship, where I came to the conclusion, if I engage with somebody and they're not okay with the medical stuff, God bless. It's what it is. No harm, no harm, no foul. It's, you know, it's not a negative for them per se. It's just not something they necessarily want. The reason why that's not the easiest thing to do, because to some degree that's rejection, and that's rejection for what's considered to be or what is a physical weakness. I got to the point where I realized I don't particularly care. If they accept me, great. If they don't, great. The world is on. You keep moving on. The first person who I ended up talking to, she was like, I don't know, man. I think you're going to die. Now, on that, I was like, okay, fair enough. That I met. After that first person, ideas in their heads about what that means. And that's problematic. What I mean by that is, it's, for example, somebody may say, I am sick, which means X. And they tend to fulfill what they have in their head about what that is. Not because they need to fulfill it, but because they have an idea of it in their head. It's like somebody would say, well, black people don't do X. Fuck does that mean? But I've heard people say stuff like that. It's people have ideas in their heads and they try to fulfill out the ideas in their heads as opposed to just kind of living their life. It's a search for meaning and then trying to fulfill the meaning that they've themselves decided. My wife does this sometimes, where she would say, well, I want to do X. And it's like, but why? I want to do X and fulfill the obligations of X. But it's like, but why? Why? Does everything necessarily need to be defined? And the very act of defining it sometimes fucks it up. Just be. Now, just being is not necessarily the easiest thing in the world. From a standpoint of being ill, one of the necessary things, and part of the reason why I'm even doing videos like this now, where I even talk about this, is because there is a strong need for determination, self-determination, where you as a person, whether you're ill or not, look at the illness as a constraint, not necessarily as a total negative. I have constraints. There's certain limitations that I have, but those limitations are not necessarily the end all be all. Those things are just things that need to be negotiated and dealt with. That's a different thing than looking at yourself as being a patient or something like that. As I got older, I started wearing that to some degree as a badge of honor. This is just a difficulty that needs to be managed, not necessarily something that's impossible to deal with. My nurses hate that, and my nurses love that. My doctors hate that, and my doctors love that. It's a love-hate relationship with that. Yes, I like the fact that you're doing these things, but oh my God, don't die. It's that stuff. It's that type of stuff. Hell yes, I was told not to travel. I went to India, Indonesia now, and Thailand. Fucking A for you, Laura. Fucking A for you. South gameplay. Can you talk about China's 2020's plan to invade Taiwan? I didn't know anything about that. A lot of people don't know about this, and the United States will come to Taiwan aid with 8 hours, potentially starting another world conflict. I've never heard about this. China planned to invade Taiwan? I have to look that one up. I have to look that one up. I never heard about that. All right, I'll look that one up. Yeah, I never heard about that one, man. Yes, what can't be cured truly is something you have to live with on your own. Oh, wow, that's way too bright. Look, constraints, they are what they are. They're not. There are times where I feel some kind of way because I feel like my wife gets a short end of the stick on certain things, or that she has to deal with something that if she was with somebody with, better, a more put together physical specimen, that she wouldn't necessarily have to deal with. By the same token, there are no perfect people, and it is impossible for me to be me without the other stuff. Meaning, who I am doesn't exist without all of this litany of other stuff that's associated with it. All of the pain, all of the aches, all of the surgeries, all of the, all of that stuff was necessary to make the individual and the personality that I am. Without those things, I don't exist. There's no way around it. You can't have one without the other. Meaning, there's no magical door to get to who you are without the shit behind it. I guess I say that to say, it's always a trade-off. There's always things that you give up in order to get something else. In her case, she got somebody that loved her. And yes, I may go too far sometimes in what the person thinks that they can accomplish. But by the same token, never necessarily let any of those things become a hindrance. It's what it is. Forsaken companion. Certain things, like always having to come eat dinner after it's cold because you're straight. No. The thing that would be a pain in the ass would be her sitting here doing work. And do you remember the Lawrence O'Donnell clip? There's a clip with Lawrence O'Donnell where Lawrence O'Donnell was like, stop the banging, stop the banging, stop the banging. Like he's screaming at the top of his lungs like a fucking maniac. And in the clip, like the clip is actually pretty funny, but there have been other people who flipped out also, like when they're doing videos or something, like they're trying to do their thing. The reason has to do with when I'm doing a video, I am absolutely aware that there are eyes on me. And the very act of being aware that there are eyes on you, even though it's you, it's the best you, or at the very least, you try to give the best you. And in trying to give the best you, there's a stream of consciousness that's associated with it. Like I'm not reading a teleprompter, I'm not reading a script, I'm not reading anything. Ultimately, I have ideas in my head when I start a show, and I go with a stream of consciousness, almost like a channel. Things outside of that fuck up the channel. That makes sense. Like when there are like noises, or there's like something takes place, it screws with it, it interrupts it, it hits it, it throws it off a little bit. And it takes a certain degree of concentration in order to keep it up. And so when she's sitting here doing her work, and I'm looking at her like, I need you to cut your music down. And she has her headphones on. I'm like, I need you to cut that down. I need you to cut that down. Is that too high? Yeah, a little bit too high. And she's like, you know, there are other people who live here, right? And it's like, yeah, I know, but you decided to be with somebody who's doing the news. And when I'm doing the news, I need you to kind of calm down. That's the shit she has to put up with. She has to put up with. Your tongue is pierced, never noticed that. How is that really relevant? Yeah, it's pierced. It's been pierced for a while. Yeah, it's been pierced for a while. Yeah. And the stream of consciousness always leads to Star Trek. Right, I know, right? Star Trek or zombies. Star Trek. Oh, my mom's here. I do pray for strength, but because of who he is, that is my strength. Oh, that's funny. Mrs. Thomas, turn down your Valium. Valium. Oh, I love that Valium. Yeah. You make decisions and go, man. You make decisions and you go. That's all you can do. Star Trek and zombies. Am I a Muslim? No, I'm not. I am not. I have a Muslim name, but no, I'm not Muslim. Or an Arabic name, but I'm not Muslim. My mom just liked the name. Oh, thank you, Laura. Thank you. Shit. Yeah, I mentioned the medical stuff, I guess, because you know, I had a conversation with a guy from Denmark, and it was actually a really good conversation. And he made this point that when you meet people from out the country, they ask, they usually is like, are you African? It's like, no. He's like, yeah, you didn't come from Africa? No. It's like an American. And they don't quite understand, because from their standpoint, when people enter the country, they're Africans. And it's like, no, born and raised in America. My grandfather was native indigenous. I have more right to that land than anybody else that's there. I was born there, raised there. It exudes from me when I open my mouth. I'm an American. And he makes this argument that, look, blacks need to own jazz. And they need to own it as an art form that they created, and own it as their own thing and take pride in that. That's a work of art. That's something that they can accomplish. Now, his point to that was people need things that they can attribute to themselves because it gives them a certain degree of pride when they're interacting with the world. They need to see themselves. So when, God, this is a horrible example, but Bill Cosby, before Bill Cosby was a rapist, or people knew Bill Cosby was a rapist, when people saw him as a lawyer, or him as a doctor, his wife as a lawyer, there's a certain degree of people, if you remember, who started going to college, African Americans. When Barack Obama made the decision to support gay marriage, there was a large number of people that, again, turned with it. There's a certain degree of when people start seeing themselves represented, it gives them a certain degree of latitude and somewhat of a luff for taking certain behaviors. It's like, I'm seeing myself do X, in which case, in seeing myself do X, I see more along the lines of people do that. I guess I feel the same way about this. People need to be more, I guess, protective, especially, and I'm talking about people who have some kind of medical thing, of their own self-determination. It's like, I'm not a goddamn patient. I'm a person who's here for a medical thing. And I know there's a distinction, and a distinction I think matters. Even with this thing of being handed over by a doctor, I bristle at this idea of going from a facility, and the facility is like, we need your information from the other clinic. It's like, okay, well, look, I don't necessarily have a clinic because I live in America. And at the moment that you stop paying for the clinic, within a month, they get rid of you. They don't necessarily give a shit about what happens to you at that point. And so all of that stuff need to be done by you. But the facilities aren't set up to do that. Not set up to do that at all. Like, understand what I mean. There was a woman who was helping me set up the facilities, and she got pissy and stopped helping me setting up the facilities. And getting pissy and stopping helping me set up the facilities, at the last minute, she tried to put the kibosh on this trip, meaning she tried to fuck up my trip. And fuck up my trip in a way where it would have left me without a facility going into Barcelona. That's aggravating. Part of the reason she was doing that is she was being an asshole, but in addition to being an asshole, she was going to be an asshole in a way that would have tried to crash and end the trip. Because for her, she didn't necessarily like this idea of me doing this trip. Fuck her. It's not her choice. People can make bad choices. It is their choice to make bad choices, especially when those choices are individual to the individual, if that makes sense. When you're trying to set up facility, the first thing they say is, where's your other facility? That's assuming that you're coming from another facility. And the problem with this is, if a person is trying to do a world trip, say, for example, the person is on dialysis and they're trying to do a world trip, how do you do that? If at some point you're not going to be coming from a facility in the United States, you're going to be coming from some other facility. But the information that they're looking for is from the previous facility that you came from the States. It almost makes the idea of a world trip nearly impossible because it makes it difficult from going from point A to point B, unless you have infinite resources. If you have infinite resources, it doesn't matter. If you have infinite resources, it doesn't matter. I don't have infinite resources. I don't have anywhere near infinite resources. We scrimp and scrape to make this shit work. And even then, it's like, oh, fuck, is this going to work? And you leverage what you can in order to make it work. It's very hard to travel with Medicaid. I don't have Medicaid. I don't have any of that. She was being petty, Jamal, and that was childish and immature of her. So, look, it's a little bit of both, right? Like, if I was writing a book, yeah, she would be a villain in this case because it created a problem. Like, initially when I was doing this, before we left, the idea was, okay, she was going to set up my, trips for nearly the entire time. And after we left, not so much. Now, it's possible that she said, oh my God, he's going to kill himself. That's possible that she said that. But I got to be honest, I suspect it's more along the lines of being petty. I suspect it was more along the lines of being petty, with this kind of political argument of, oh my God, he's going to kill himself. Fact is, if you kill yourself, you can't finish the trip. The incentive in this is not for me to kill myself. That said, and I know that sounds insane to say, but it's true. The incentive is not to die. But you're stuck with the reality. Now, that reality is, if I'm going to do from point A to point B, so say I'm starting in Lisbon. Lisbon, the treatments are cheap, dirt cheap for Europe. And the dialysis is better because, you know, their system is built on a certain degree of socialized medicine. Everybody here, for the most part, can get treatments. In fact, if you're in Europe, you can get treatments anywhere. Hell, if you're a European, you can even get treatments in other countries where you don't have to pay for those treatments. Not an American. Not as an American. The most aggravating aspect of this trip, if I'm being very honest, is this idea when you're going from point A to point B that it's almost impossible to do it as a person, as your own. Because each facility is looking for a doctor to hand you over to another facility. Bristle at that. I bristle at that. And there's something also about it where it's like going from one facility to the next, to the next, to the next. Because understand, from Kenya, which again, treatments are dirt cheap. Quality treatments, but dirt cheap. To Egypt, you get screwed. They fuck you over on those, but it's Egypt. To Lisbon, again, dirt cheap. And then from Lisbon to Barcelona, extremely expensive. Now, the moment that the treatment goes expensive, you're stuck with the dilemma. You can't afford to get a full set. And so you have to leverage what can I tolerate physically versus what I can afford economically. And that's where the rubber meets the road. And that's where you have to make honest decisions about what you can afford, how long you can stay at a particular place. There's an area in Spain where you can get a treatment for like $100. That is not Barcelona. Now, I didn't realize that until later on. In retrospect, we should have just went to that particular part of Spain to get that particular treatment. But initially, we were working in a reality where the treatments were being set up by somebody else until they were not. You make choices. Self-determination. You choose. It's not necessarily that the choices don't have consequences. There are times where you will feel shitty because you made a choice of trying to stretch it out because you couldn't necessarily afford to have, let's say, 2 or 3 within the course of that week. There are other times where you say, fuck, I gotta get this treatment, which means it is gonna hurt like hell for this particular week. Or this is gonna be a hell month between them. Here's another thing. The choices changed when your reality changes. So in Lisbon, it's like, oh yeah, the schedule that I set up for the other one is not going to work because there's going to be a requirement of more treatments in order to make up for the lack of treatments for the previous week. You have to make those conscious choices. And those choices need to change when the reality changes. The reality in this case was, yeah, there's no way to pull that off, and that schedule is nonsense, meaning you need to add additional treatments into it, because if you're ill, you're not going to be able to do your videos, nor are you going to be able to travel, which kind of defeats the point of all of this. Sober choices, man. It just is what it is. Poland, cheap. When you get into like Romania, Lithuania, cheap. When you get into Vietnam, Bangkok, cheap. Europe hurts. Europe fucking hurts. Which is why we're not going to Amsterdam, which is why we're not going to London, which is why I think Germany for like 1 week. Yeah, man. It's insane. It's insane. Why are we paying for health care for the rich when we don't want to pay for it for the poor? That's insanity. It's hard to travel while making sure that there's bacon cheeseburgers at your overseas destinations. You know, it's funny. In Egypt, in Israel and those type of countries, there's religious stuff. And because there's religious stuff, no bacon is on the menu. It's no bacon. No bacon. Laura H., the fact that America doesn't have free access to healthcare is truly sick. The government has no right to point to other countries' failings when they treat us like this. Yeah, I mean, but come on. I agree with you, but at some point, Europe made a choice to cover everybody. If you're born, your birthright is healthcare. We didn't make that choice in America. We thought it was okay for people to have these vicious medical bills. Even with Medicare, and Medicare only pays 80%. Do you realize that most people who are on dialysis don't work? And when they don't work, they don't have a secondary insurance. And if they don't have a secondary insurance, they just go into debt. They just go into debt. Now, they may get the National Kidney Foundation to help pay for some of this stuff, but ultimately, many of the people just go into debt. Meaning, if you're ill, you're almost given a debt sentence just by virtue of birth. By birth. It's fucked up. If I was born in Europe, none of this would be an issue. None of this would be an issue. Jamal is talking himself into a no-fly list. That's fucking hilarious. Oh, that's fucking hilarious. Medical bankruptcy is a beautiful thing. No, it is not. No, it is not. It's still bankruptcy. Still bankruptcy. Mr. Sunglasses is cool like Snoopy cool. Dax J, they could live happily in Portugal. All right. I've talked in circles enough. All right, guys. If you enjoy the content, please feel free to share, like, subscribe. And you can always support the content through Patreon. Thanks all.